Welcome to Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho, and joining me on Shaka Extra Live himself is Shaka Sali, aka the Kabale Kid. Hello, Shaka.
I am terrific. How are you today, Paul?
I'm great. Thanks for asking. And how about you?
Well, I'm doing fine, just fine.
So a warm welcome to you all our Facebook followers watching us from all over the world. Shaka Extra Time is a place where you get to talk to Shaka himself. Again, this week we are talking about Zimbabwe, Kenya. We'll probably go into Nigeria a little bit and Uganda. Let's start in Zimbabwe. It looks like the crocodile. The crocodile is at the mantle of power, and he's beginning to move things around and maybe lead that country to the new prosperity. Your thoughts, Shaka?
There's no question about who is in charge of the store as far as Zimbabwe is concerned. It is the crocodile, it seems to me, that has in fact been in control of the store in Zimbabwe for quite some time, probably without Mugabe's actual knowledge. Because let's face it, most people thought that you have change, not simply change at the top, where you have a president, but also change underneath the presidency. But frankly, nothing much has changed. It seems to be more of the same. It seems to me that you did have really, yes, change at the top, but probably pretty much something that looks like continuity. Why am I saying that? Most people had expected, for example, to see a cabinet that looked like Zimbabwe, that reflects the diversity, the political diversity, the cultural diversity, the gender, and what have you, the youth, and you name it, as part of the new cabinet. That has not happened, Paul.
Did that surprise you? Because a lot of people, people that I've talked to, especially people from Zimbabwe, seem to think that this is more of a continuation of Robert Mugabe's administration.
But obviously, yeah, there's no question that it is not a trajectory change, because most people, of course, probably were looking for a trajectory change. But that isn't going to happen. But you know, it seems, it looks like, of course, you had what you would call, in political science, they call it an intra-elite strife within the ruling ZANU party. And so it is like a sort of political civil war within a family. And the head of the family has been, tossed aside, and a new head of the family has emerged. And one would have thought that he probably would come with people that were seen to be loyal to him, and probably who would look like different from the ones who were loyal to the man that replaced Robert Gabriel Mugabe. But some of the names, frankly, are basically the same. You're looking at the finance minister, for example, Patrick Chinamasa. He's the same. Same man. You really, when you look at...
and this is the same guy they were saying that he had stolen a lot of money.
No. The guy that is said to have stolen a lot of money is right now in remand. He was actually the immediate finance minister who happened to be a very, very close ally of G40. And that is the group, of course, that was behind the possibility of Dr. Grace Mugabe becoming the new kid, the new girl on the block. Of course, it didn't happen because people like the crocodile, alongside his friends like General Constantino Chiwenga, thought otherwise.
Who might actually also become, according to media reports that I've seen, that General Chiwenga could become the new vice president if things go his way, or if his wishes come true.
And why not? I mean, you do have a new president in Harare, courtesy, in fact, of the leadership of General Chiwenga himself. He is a very popular individual from what I have been following, I've been reading and stuff like that. So, he could even, in fact, have been the man himself. So if he became the vice president, given that he is 61 years young, meaning that he is in fact about 14 years younger than President Emerson Mnangagwa. It means that he could well be looking at State House, Harare, perhaps after Mnangagwa has been able to do either one term or 2 terms for that matter.
But
After all, Zimbabwe does have term limits, mind you. It's not like your country, Uganda.
Interesting. Let's stay on Zimbabwe first. Put yourself in President Emerson Mnangagwa's shoes. Right now, let's assuming that Constantino Chiwenga becomes the vice president. Would you want a guy like that who is hugely popular deputizing you or being the first vice president? Anything could happen. Obviously, he still has the support of the people.
That's true too. But one thing that you shouldn't forget also, Paul, is that the crocodile has a history. The crocodile himself is a soldier. He is a soldier, having had a training besides the law school, the University of Zambia actually, where he got a Bachelor of Laws. The crocodile underwent military training in Tanzania. He underwent military training in Egypt, and he actually went to Nanjing, somewhere in China. The crocodile has credentials of soldiering. The crocodile has actually been in charge of security of the country, as it were, having been defense minister, in which case, in fact, he was a direct boss of a young man called Constantino Chiwenga, and I'm sure at that time he had not actually made it to the ranks of the general. So who knows how many, probably, I would say privileges Crocodile may in fact have provided to a young man called Chiwenga by the time he becomes a general. The Crocodile was in charge of basically the Central Intelligence Organization, the Zimbabwean equivalent of CIA. He was also in charge of the state security, really, so to speak. So this is a man who has been all over the place, has had opportunities, for example, to recruit, to send individuals for training, to promote, and place them strategically. So I think Crocodile is a man, frankly, who probably is owed a lot by people like Chiwenga. He's probably cashing, the kind of, they call IOUs back right now. So I think he should be very comfortable.
So you think that General Constantine Chiwenga will be loyal to Emerson Mnangagwa?
I think right now I don't see anything to contradict that, because let's face it, some of the reports that we have been able to access suggest that when, for example, the Crocodile ran away from Zimbabwe and found his way in Johannesburg, you remember he issued a very interesting statement.
Right.
The man was too confident, really. And he said, I shall be back. And a couple of weeks, guess what? The guy is back.
He got a hero's welcome.
Precisely. And of course, one of the telephone calls he is alleged to have made was to General Constantino Chiwenga. There are reports, in fact, that they even met in the Chinese capital, Beijing, in order to sell the coup to the Chinese. And the Chinese, according to those reports, gave them a green light. So I think these guys, they come from far away, a long way, so much that they should be able to be comfortable. Is it in blue, the blue roof house or something like that?
What does President Emerson Mnangagwa bring to the table, despite having served with the previous regime, despite him having what other people would characterize as impeccable credentials to be in that position? What else does he bring to the table? Is he a man of the people, for example?
Well, first of all, he is pretty much a bureaucrat, I suppose, really, having been in so many different ministries, really, during the Mugabe administration. He's also a man whose loyalty is proven. He's been very loyal to the old man. until really a couple of weeks ago when the old man decided that he was probably going to give a nod to somebody who the crocodile and his colleagues felt pretty much that this person, Dr. Grace Mugabe, who obviously seems to be a genius, having gotten an earned PhD in 2 months at the University of Zimbabwe, of course, a university whose chancellor was the husband. And I say genius really because mine took 6 years, my friend, at UCLA, so you can imagine. But, these people said, look, this Grace does not really have a historical link to the liberation struggle that we are part of. And Mr. Mugabe, you are in that blue rooftop house precisely because of us. And we are the ones that have been running these things. And you cannot transform ZANU-PF into a family party, a family property. Instead of you kicking me out and my colleagues, I will be back. And guess what? You are the ones that will be kicked out of ZANU-PF. And life will go on. And guess what? It happened. I think what he needs to do, frankly, to reassure not only Zimbabweans, but the people across the continent, and indeed globally, is that he has to be able to change direction in some of the policies, frankly. Especially, you're talking about the elephant in the room here, the land issue, the land policy. He has already said he is not going to reverse that policy. That is understandable. But that he is going, for example, to look at possible ways of compensation, compensating those people who lost the land. But Zimbabweans also will probably want another sort of land reform in the sense that a lot of reports suggest that this land was not really given to Zimbabweans per se, but that you had to be a ZANU party card-carrying member. And I'm sure that a lot of other Zimbabweans, frankly, would want to have some access to some of that real estate.
Let's go to comments and let's start in Congo, Brazzaville from Yamadou Dainka. The situation in Kenya is very important for the peace so that the opposition and the government have to go through new development for the next of Kenya and Africa. Your thoughts?
Very important. I think the gentleman from Brazzaville makes sense. You need to have some kind of, these two parties really coming together. I'm talking about President Uhuru Kenyatta with his Jubilee Party. He cannot rule the country comfortably unless he gets cooperation from the party that is led by Raila Odinga, the NASA people who say they do not recognize his administration. So I think that there need to be very, very serious talks here, really, for people to figure out a way forward for Kenya. And it's not only for Kenya, for the region, because Kenya is not only important for Kenyans alone, by the way. Kenya does not only belong to Kenyans. Kenya belongs to Kenyans, it belongs to the region, it belongs to Africa for the most part, as an international, trade hub, as an international export hub and all that kind of stuff. Kenya belongs to all of us. Kenya, for example, actually does have probably, arguably, the third largest UN complex in the world after New York and Geneva. You're talking about Nairobi. So there are thousands of international staffers and what have you. And so there is a lot of interest. They have also regional headquarters in terms of multinational corporations and what have you, and a lot of other things. And let's face it, if you cannot have peace and stability in Kenya, and with peace and stability, I'm not talking about police, imposing peace or something that looks like peace. But if you cannot have a semblance of socio-economic justice in Kenya. And therefore, you cannot have, for example, the port of Mombasa, you know, functioning normally and what have you. You can imagine the consequences really of that, especially in the region.
Let's go to another commenter from Uganda, Tumwesji Alexandra in Ibanda, Uganda. He wonders whether President Uhuru Kenyatta will be able to unite Kenyans despite Odinga's side that is insisting on even swearing in Raila Odinga.
But Paul, again, that is pretty much about the same question, really. I mean, let's face it. We don't know what is going to happen from next week on Tuesday, because next week on Tuesday is Jamahuri Day in Kenya, and that is when Raila Odinga and his supporters said that he actually is going to be inaugurated as someone that is going to be in charge of what they call people's assemblies. They have also, of course, you know, invoked what you would call a boycott. It seems actually to be biting. I don't know how long it is going to last, but it seems to be biting. Again, there's no question, there's no substitute, frankly, for these two leaders of their people coming together around a huge table and figuring out the things that they have in common, especially in the context of their people, and figuring out a way forward. Because let's face it, you need a political solution. You need a political solution, and when you look at the last elections, depending on where you are, there was no election that satisfies everybody. You have a country actually split in two. And so you have to go beyond rhetoric. Uhuru talks about how he wants to be a president of all Kenya. But someone said that he said exactly the same thing back in 2013, and nothing much happened. So he can't just be seen to be talking the talk. He has to be seen to walking the talk so that Kenyans can walk the walk.
Let's go to Sylvain in Denmark. Kindly comment on Macron's visit to West Africa and the discussions about not interfering in Africa's politics without discussing the question of economic freedoms and justice for all.
I think it was very interesting that the new French president happened to be in West Africa, and I remember when he was in Burkina Faso, at the University of Burkina Faso, and I think somebody in the audience asked him about the air conditioning and all that kind of stuff, and he said, wait a minute, I am not president of Burkina Faso. And in fact, this is not the time, frankly, for a president of France to be involved in those types of things. Those types of things are responsibilities of the man that you yourselves actually voted for, your president. It is very interesting. I think he is a young man. He obviously has the benefit of history and what have you. I am sure that he understands very well about people who are not particularly happy about the influence of what used to be the Francophone and all that kind of stuff. You know, France was so powerful in Francophone, their former colonial possessions, which, by the way, they were so intellectually arrogant so as not to call them colonies. In fact, they said they were overseas provinces, meaning they were an integral part of France. And they had a central bank, so much that, in fact, you did not need central banks in these former Francophone countries because the bank was in Paris.
They still use the CFA
even
in most
though,
countries.
even though the French themselves no longer use the CFA. In fact, they use the euro. Very interesting. But that's part of how they control the whole place. In fact, they also control the security. And that is the reason why, historically, there were not so many coups, military coups, in the former Francophone, you know, Africa. But I think that this is a man, obviously, who seems to be representing something new. He seems to be a little bit more sober, not wanting to dominate, but rather wanting to create an environment or a situation where there is a sort of partnership, mutual respect.
I like that idea. It reminds me of the Berlin conference where Africa was partitioned into small countries without the representation of Africa.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's part, of course, that's part of the inheritance that the French got.
Let's go to another comment from Kimboa Santos along the same lines of Europeans, Western countries taking care of Africa. He wonders how African countries can do away with the World Bank and the IMF.
Well, first of all, Africans really, let's face it, they need the Bretton Woods institutions because at least the World Bank, the IMF, there are some of the institutions that provide low interest rates. But of course, they also have conditions and what have you. The good thing so far is that African leaders, more than ever before, they now really have options. They have, for example, a new bank set up by the BRICS. We're talking about a group comprising of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. They have that bank that creates an option, an alternative. They can also deal with some other emerging economies. We're talking about Brazil. Brazil was doing very well and what have you, but lately not very good. But you still have Brazil, you still have Turkey, you have India, you have all that kind of stuff. So you do have some options before, so you can actually look at the various options available to you as a leader of an African country and decide that, you know what, I think this is better than this. Whereas before, you didn't have much of a choice. It was the Bretton Woods institutions that called the shots. And they came up with their own packages and what have you. And usually, really, look, we talk about the World Bank. The question is it really a World Bank? Or is it a bank that, in fact, is controlled by some countries which, some of them, in fact, like the US, has veto power. They can decide whether to give you money or not. So you have to be careful about calling it a World Bank sometimes because it actually is owned by some people who have more interests and more say in it.
Let's go to another Facebook comment from Bosco Omero. He says, do you think the Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni can be lenient enough to resign peacefully, especially in light of the events that have happened in Zimbabwe and what happened yesterday in Yemen? Those two dictators are long gone. The one in Yemen was killed by some rival group. What do you make of that?
The one in Yemen, as a matter of fact, had been a former president, correct?
Yeah, but he was still running the show. Yeah.
He had been a former president. I believe, if I remember correctly, had actually gone to live in Ethiopian capital Addis Ababa and what have you. I don't even know what he was again doing in Yemen
he's
and what
been
have
back. He allied with another group and he was part of leading the rebel movement to overthrow the current government.
I understand. Of course, he had also been
supported by the
for
Saudis
a very long time.
Yeah, 34 years.
Yeah, you know, the thing is, let's face it. I think that question would probably be best answered, not better, best answered by Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni himself. If I were, of course, to be in a position where I could provide some advice with a former friend of my father, Yoweri Museveni used to be very good friends with John Wilson Mushakamba, the man from Chikunjiri Kabale, where the kid, from Kabale comes from. I would say, you have really had the opportunity. Ugandans have given you an opportunity to serve, even beyond serving. I know that Mr. Museveni sometimes will say, in fact, that he's not really gaining anything because
he's a servant leader.
He's not only a servant, no, forget about servant leader. He says he and his family are sacrificing for Uganda. And he said also at one time, which is very interesting, that he is not anybody's servant really. He is not anybody's servant. he works for the interests of his children and his grandchildren. I don't know whether he was misquoted or not, but he clearly said he is nobody's servant. You know, he is a freedom fighter. He is a revolutionary leader. And he's been on record as saying, alongside of course, a former leader of Libya, a former Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. The late Muammar Gaddafi said he never used the title president, by the way. He was brother leader. Or if he wanted to indulge himself, he would say he was the king of African kings. That one said, and in fact he stated a statement one time, I think in Kampala, Yoweri Museveni was next to him, and he said, I am a revolutionary leader. Revolutionary leaders like us do not simply leave power. We don't leave power because of elections, through a piece of paper and what have you. And in fairness to Mr. Gaddafi, really, unlike, for example, Yoweri Museveni or former Zimbabwean President Robert Gabriel Mugabe, he never even, indulged in elections. He was so contemptuous of elections that he never subjected himself to them. He simply stayed in power until the UN resolutions, of course, did him in. And his body, unfortunately, ended up in a butchery. Could you imagine? He's gone. Mr. Mugabe said he was never going to be referred to as the former Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe. He would just be the late. By the way, is now former president. So, Mr. Museveni, probably you could do yourself and the country and the continent very proud, really, stepping aside so that somebody who is younger, with younger ideas, better ideas, can step on your shoulders so that he and Uganda can see a little bit further.
What's on top tomorrow on Straight Talk Africa?
Tomorrow we have a special edition of Straight Talk Africa. We are airing a documentary, really, on Boko Haram. You know what Boko Haram, of course, is doing or not doing in the northeastern part of Nigeria.
Any final thoughts on the leadership in Africa? Where do we go from here? Well,
very interesting is, of course, with the resignation of Mr. Mugabe, or in fact, the overthrow of Mugabe, because this was a coup. They may not say a coup, but it was a de facto coup. It may not be de jure according to law, because the constitution was never suspended. But no one would deny that those tanks were on the streets. No one would deny that Mr. Mugabe was in fact under arrest, and eventually he had to cave in. So I think with the end of him, it's end of an era. And we hope that we can have a new type of leadership that Africa really, I think deserves, so that Africa can develop and become part of a better story in the international community context.
Thank you so much, Shaka, for being a good guest. I look forward to hosting you on another edition of Shaka Extra Time next week. Until then, so long from Washington, D.C. Thank you.
Thank you, too.